Hey everybody, it's Steve Presser, and we are in week number 3 now of our Advent study, Perspectives of the Promise. This week's an interesting one. As you can see, we've lit our third candle on our Advent wreath, the candle of joy. And yet, oddly enough, we're going to be talking about one of the most joyless persons of all the Christmas story, King Herod. The irony in that can't be overstated. So what I want to do in this lesson is to give you a lot of history and background surrounding King Herod, because as you turn to Matthew chapter 2, it begins with the wise men coming from the east into Jerusalem because they followed the star. They get to the main city, Jerusalem. They find King Herod and they say, "We are here to worship the new King of the Jews." And it says here in verse 3, when King Herod heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Now, when it says all Jerusalem with him, the readers of Matthew's gospel at that time, surely, especially if they lived through the days of Herod, they knew exactly what that meant. So, let's just get a little bit of history lesson to Herod and also Matthew, because Matthew is the only one who records anything about King Herod specifically as it relates to the Christmas story. It's interesting when you read through the scriptures, most writers have kind of a genre or a theme about them. And for Matthew, he writes from a very Hebrew-driven mindset. And when you read through Matthew, I challenge you to do this sometime, read through Matthew with this idea in mind, that Matthew is trying to present Jesus as the King of the Jews. And if you have that mindset in mind as you go and you read through the Gospel of Matthew, especially these early couple of chapters, it really brings this whole story to life, especially with King Herod. Because Matthew's Gospel begins again by articulating Jesus' rightful place as King of the Jews. He does so by tracing all the lineage in chapter 1. And so Matthew's Gospel then is bookended by Gentiles who recognize what many Jews still question. Is this or is this not the King of the Jews? We see that in the wise men from the beginning, and we see that at the end when Jesus is suffering on his cross. So, who is King Herod? Well, King Herod was the king over Judea at this particular point in time. His son Archelaus reigned briefly after him. King Herod Antipas ruled over Galilee after that, and later killed John the Baptist. You might remember that story. He would later kill John the Baptist. He would then question Jesus before his crucifixion. And then Herod Agrippa, the nephew of Antipas, he was the one who later imprisoned Peter and killed James. And then Agrippa II would later question Paul as he was sent to Rome. So you have to be careful with the Herodians as to which Herod we're speaking about. In this instance and in this story, we're looking at King Herod, the main King Herod here. So a little bit more history. In about 167 BC, so roughly 167 years before Jesus was born, almost 100 years before Herod, Jerusalem was under control of the Greeks. And the Greeks prohibited the sacrifices of the Jews, and they themselves set up all sorts of idols inside the temple. They were attempting to kind of snuff out Judaism, and it all led to a successful revolt, which is remembered and celebrated as Hanukkah. It was the time where the Greeks were essentially pushed out of Jewish life and culture. They were pushed out of the temple, and the temple was rededicated. Obviously, during that festival of lights, the Hanukkah season, they only had a little bit of oil, which lasted for quite some time, and it was deemed a miracle in their day. Nonetheless, that revolt, the revolt leaders led to an establishment of new rulers for about 8 or 9 decades called the Hasmoneans. And the high priests under the Hasmonean dynasty also would ascribe for themselves the name of king. And so this was to be, it would be an expanding kingdom led by these Jewish kings. Now, Herod's father, as time goes on, His name was Antipater. And Antipater rose to power in Idumea, which is south of Jerusalem. And conflict came between the Hasmoneans and two of their brothers as they were striving to become king. And the conflict escalated, leading then to the involvement of the Romans. Now, Antipater would later assist Julius Caesar in his conquest of Egypt over Pompey, and as thanks for his support, Caesar makes Antipater the procurator of Judea, and then Herod becomes the governor of Galilee. Antipater and Herod were now officially Roman rulers as a result. So, time marches on, more strife and war break out. Herod flees to Rome, and he gains the support of Mark Antony and returns to defeat the revolt and is established king by decree of Rome. It's so much history. Herod married into the Hasmonean family. He took and made several gestures of goodwill. However, given the history that we just uncovered, Herod was very suspicious of the Hasmonean family and had many of them spied upon. He would bring charges of espionage and conspiracy among many of his own family members and even have them executed. He took on many, many large building projects as a way of appeasing the Romans as well. So some see these accomplishments as reason to give credit to Herod. We call him Herod the Great, in large part because of these accomplishments. But for the Jews, Herod's accomplishments were nothing short of self-serving and appeasing to the Romans. So some of the things that he did that earned him the name Herod the Great. He built fortresses throughout the land to house many of his armies and offer himself safe passage and safe hiding. Along the coast of Samaria, we see the city of Caesarea, and that was built by Herod as a way of honoring Caesar. This included large harbors to support goods and visitors and shipping across the Mediterranean Sea. Caesarea also housed many theaters for drama and music. It had a hippodrome there. There was a lot of nude athletic competitions that took place in this, as well as gladiatorial combat. So even in Jesus' day, this was very, very prominent. Herod also built a temple in Caesarea and dedicated it to the worship of Caesar, who the Roman Senate declared to be God, right? And the most ambitious project that he did was the Jewish temple. So Herod wanted to have his name stamped into the history books a little bit. And so the Jewish temple was one of his biggest projects that he wanted to do. Now, he was raised Jewish, although he had a little bit of kind of a mixed cultural blend, obviously. And so for many people, they don't see Herod as being a true Jew. And even his being raised Jewish and how he practiced Judaism may have been considered very suspect. Herod survived many assassination attempts. He had spies in the region who reported criticism of the government, leading to Herod to kill thousands of people, sometimes hundreds even at a time. Herod had his own wife killed, his own brother killed, and 3 of his own sons killed for treason. He was incredibly zealous and jealous for his own throne. And here's something just absolutely crazy. In his own dying days, Herod ordered the murder of many Jews in the Hippodrome so that the Jews would be so emotionally distraught that they would be unavailable to celebrate Herod's own death. Wow. Can you just imagine that? So who is this King Herod? Well, like I said, he was a bit of a Gentile king, although he was raised Jewish. He was zealous for his own crown, and word of this new king of the Jews suddenly onto the scene not only brought great worry to Herod, but the entire city as well. We read as the story continues that when the wise men trick Herod and they do not return to him as he requested, Herod goes and slaughters the children 2 years and younger rather, down in Bethlehem. And we don't see that recorded in history, but we do see it recorded in Scripture. And one reason it's left out of the history books, we might say, is because, quite frankly, these types of actions from Herod were very, very common. And in a small town like Bethlehem, for maybe, for lack of a better term, a small handful of children to be murdered wasn't any front page news in the life of Herod, sadly. So what do we learn about Herod? We learn that he was a man who was power hungry. We learn that he was a man of great panic. And we also see that he was a man of great pride. And all these things led him to do the atrocities that he did. But here's one of the things that I find unique, is that when Jesus was taken away by Joseph and Mary and they flee, here's a couple of points that we should make. Christ dwells where he is welcomed, right? They flee Herod, obviously, and Christ will dwell where he is welcomed. I say that because the presence of Jesus largely depends upon the current environment. Are we welcoming or are we hostile to Jesus? We're looking at perspectives of the promise. Well, what's the perspective of Herod? He wanted nothing to do with Jesus. He was hostile to Jesus. And so we maybe should ask ourselves that same question. Are we the king of our own heart, or is Jesus seated on the throne of our heart? Are we welcoming or hostile to Jesus? We need to realize, too, that there really is only one eternal kingdom. So whether it's Herod trying to build his empire or you and I trying to build our own, we have to keep this in perspective, that there's really only one king, and there's only one king who is eternal. And all the other small kingdoms that will be built will rise and fall as the Lord wills. But the last thing here is to consider your legacy. When Herod died, the angel told Joseph that it was safe to return to Israel. But an angel also told Joseph not to return to where he wanted to go, but rather to go to Nazareth, because Herod's son was on the throne. And that's something that we really ought to maybe dwell on for a little bit. What is the legacy you're leaving behind to your children and to your children's children, right? It's just something that we really need to consider, is how we are being an example to those who are going to follow in our own footsteps. So I hope this has helped you to kind of put some skin on the bone here as to the story of who Herod was and what he was all about. And I hope that you can consider the protest of Herod. And then think about your own life and how you are either welcoming or unwelcoming to Christ the Savior. God bless you and your family.